Hello friends, my name is Rakesh and today we are going to discuss about very important concept in JavaScript that is called closures. Closures are basically one of the most asked questions in interviews and it's a confusing concept. So let's see closures in easy way. So before we begin understanding closures, we have to understand scopes, scope nesting, lexical scope, and then we can understand closures. So let's begin with the scope. To understand scope, let's see, we have a function f1 that we are invoking here, and we have a variable called result with the value 0. So if you see in this example, what should be the output of what should like it gets printed? Let's see. So we have two outputs here, one is 0 and second one is error. So why 0 is coming? Because this result variable that has a scope in function f1 can be printed out here, but if we try to print result that is not in the scope, it will give you the error, result is not defined. Let's continue with another example. In this example, we have two functions f1 and f2, and both the functions have the same variable name result but with different values. So what will happen if we try to invoke function 1 and function 2? Let's say, so if we have invoked function f1 and f2, we see the output 0 and 1 and there is no error at all because the scope is different. The scope for result is, this result is in the function f1 and scope of this result variable will be this function f2. So both different functions can have same variable names with different scope and it will not collide. So this is another example of scope. Let's understand with another example, scopes nesting. So in scope nesting, let's see what happens. We have two functions, but here the function f2 is defined inside function f1. And if you see here, function f2 is actually trying to access a variable that is defined in function 1 scope. So is it possible, can function f2 access outer variable? Let's say if we try to run it, we will see the output accessing from f1 and accessing from f2. So yes, both these functions can access the variable f1 variable, right? So this means inner functions can have access to outer functions. So this is called scope nesting. So I hope this is also clear. So let's move to a lexical scope. Lexical scope is also a very important one and it is very quite often asked in interviews, what is lexical scope? So in simple terms, lexical scope means inside the inner scope, you can access variables of outer scope. So as in the same last example, we have function f1. Inside function f1, we have function f2, and inside function f2, we have function f3. Okay, and we have different variables 1, 2, 3 inside each of the functions. Now, if I try to do console log in the first function f1, and if we try to access the global variable, will it print or not? Let's see. Okay, so it prints. So basically, if you see here in function f1, if we try to access global variable, it can access global variable. So this inner function can access outer function, outer scope, and it can print f1. In the same way, f2 and f3 can access global variable, outer variable, and inner scope variable. So this basically, this is an example of lexical scoping, which says inside inner function can have access to outer scopes. Okay, so this is called lexical scoping. So if you understood lexical scoping, now let's move on to closures. For closures, we will try to understand with two examples. The first example that we already covered earlier, it has two functions f1 and f2, and both the functions can access variable 1, right? Inner function can access outer variable, this one. So this is what this is called lexical scoping. As I told you, the lexical scoping of f2 is this one plus its outer function. So this is the lexical scope of f2. Now if you see, function 2 f2 is being invoked here. Okay, so it means function f2 is being invoked in the lexical scope of f2. What will happen if we move if we call this function f2 out of the lexical scope? Okay, so right now it is being called in the lexical scope. Let's see what will happen if we call this outside the lexical scope. Okay, so again, now what we are doing here, we have another function f3. Okay, if we see the above one, we have function f1 with a variable f1 variable, and we have function f2 which is directly accessing its outer scope variable f1 variable. And now instead of invoking the function f2 here in its lexical scope, we are actually returning it into another function. So now if we call f1 here, it is returning f2, this function, and it is assigning it into a variable my function. And here we are actually calling the my function, that is f2 function. But if you notice, we are now not calling this f2 in its lexical scope. We are calling it in another scope, that's the scope of function 3. So what will happen, whether it will remember this outer variable or not? Let's see. Oh, so now if you see here, it is still able to access outer variable even though it is outside the lexical scope. So this function f2 is actually a closure. It is as simple as that. Okay, so let's see a couple of examples of closures in real life. So the first one is event handler. You might have used a button click event handler, like you have a button in the UI and you are using add event listener and you are calling a button clicked function. So if you see here, the button clicked function is actually accessing this variable button click plus plus that is outside this function. So this is an example of closure. So button clicked is a closure. In the same way, if you see this callback, you are actually accessing this function callback is actually accessing a constant, a variable message, okay, inside this function. This callback function is a closure. In a nutshell, a closure is a function that accesses its lexical scope even executed outside of its lexical scope. So I hope this video is clear to you, and the concept of closures is very crystal clear to you also. To see more videos like this, kindly subscribe to my channel, and thank you very much.